All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our second event of the inaugural season of the Ted Rose Lecture Series, sponsored by the African-American Studies Department. We are thrilled tonight to have Dr. Touré Reed with us for this event, which is co-sponsored by the History Department, the Political Science Department, the NAACP, the Black Student Organization Coalition, and the Multicultural Center. Dr. Reed is a professor of 20th century US and Afro-American history at Illinois State University. He earned his master's and Ph.D. in history from Columbia University. And Professor Reed has published in a number of outlets, including Catalyst, the Journal of American Ethnic History, Labor, Nonsite, Black Agenda Report, Commondreams, The Nation, and The New Republic. He is the author of two books. His first is not Alms, but Opportunity, The Urban League and the Politics of Racial Uplift from 1910 to 1950 from UNC Press. And his most recent book came out last year is Towards Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism from Verso Books. His talk tonight is titled The Pitfalls of Woke Neoliberalism, The Conservative Implications of Liberal Race Reductionism. And with that intro, I will turn it over to Dr. Reed for his talk, and I will join back in for question and answer after the talk is done. Dr. Reed, take it away.
Good evening. If we were in person, I would ask how you're all doing tonight, but it's impossible to read an audience via this format. So I'll just say that I hope you and your loved ones are not just surviving in these crazy times, but I hope you're all thriving. I'm honored to be with you this evening as part of the Ted Rose guest speaker series. That said, I need to give thanks to Dr. Daniel Moak for recommending that I give a talk on my new book, Toward Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism. I also need to give an even bigger thanks to the chair of the African-American Studies Department, Dr. Baina Jeffries. Dr. Jeffries has been exceptionally generous and patient with me as the pandemic has apparently strengthened my commitment to the absent-minded professor cliche. I know as department chair, Dr. Jeffries has to be extremely busy, but despite all of the many things that are on her plate, she really went above and beyond for me. Finally, I need to thank all of you who imagined that I might have something interesting to say this evening. I have to confess that reading a lecture to people in Ohio and perhaps around the globe from my basement bunker in central Illinois during the zombie apocalypse, as I like to call it, is more than a little awkward. I've never really been comfortable just reading a lecture to a live audience because I thrive on interacting with an audience. But unfortunately, because of the format and obviously the pandemic, I will be reading a lecture to you. So I hopefully it won't be too painful. Before I get into the meat of the talk, I want to lead off with a reflection on a ubiquitous allegation that's been wearing on me for a while. The allegation is the charge of class reductionism, which is a phrase that I'm sure many of you have heard, maybe some of you have used. Like all of my research projects, Toward Freedom explores the relationship between race and class, and of course, the impact of racial and class dynamics on the lives of Black Americans. Toward Freedom's origins begin with an August 2015 article I published in Jacobin magazine titled, Why Liberals Separate Race from Class. In this piece, I explored the role of race and class in New Deal and post-war liberalism as a vehicle for challenging the then commonplace mischaracterization of Senator Bernie Sanders as a liberal class reductionist. Back then, I had thought of class reductionists as people who presume that class is the only source of inequality that matters, and who therefore believe that extant racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., are either not consequential to people's lives or can be redressed simply through economic measures alone. I guess such people exist, though I don't think I've crossed paths with too many. But that's probably owed in part to the fact that I'm not on Twitter. Although I've been called a class reductionist by some, I most certainly do not believe, nor have I ever argued in print or anyplace else, that class measures alone will redress extant racial inequality. In fact, I've not only witnessed racism, but as a Black man, I've experienced it firsthand. Now, I'll confess that I'm critical of the dominant essentialist meaning of diversity. However, I not only believe in the value of diversity, but I've published at least 3 articles defending affirmative action. Better yet, I state explicitly in Toward Freedom that anti-discrimination policies remain necessary because, wait for it, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., do indeed undercut people's life chances. There's no question about that. The juxtaposition between what I have argued in one column and what I am alleged to have argued in another column has led me to conclude that the charge of class reductionist is a shotgun blast allegation which is readily leveled at those who insist on following through on the implications of the social constructiveness of race. In my case, narrowly, this means insisting that class-based policies are essential to redressing the issues that impact poor and working class Black people disproportionately, but not exclusively. Fundamentally, racism is prejudice against members of so-called racial groups. Although racial groups are supposed to be biological populations, most biologists and most anthropologists agree that race is socially constructed. The phrase race is a social construct means that race was invented by people for some reason or another. In the American context, the reason would appear to be to treat as natural. So the reason that race was invented was to treat as natural inequalities that are the product of human beings, like colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, or late capitalism, as opposed to the work of God or some evolutionary process. At this moment, however, the ubiquity of biological and divine metaphors like racism is in our DNA, which President Obama and Secretary Hillary Clinton were both very fond of, or racism is our original sin, makes clear that even many of us who preface our statements about race and racial inequality with, of course, race is a social construct, don't really believe that race is a social construct. To be perfectly honest, the notion of divine or genetic inborn dispositions actually sounds racist to me. A conceptual cousin of perspectives advanced by the likes of Charles Murray, Richard Herrnstein, or Madison Grant. Our current moment may have given rise to particularly public and zealous uncoupling of race and racism from the social world human beings have made. And I should probably restate that since I butchered it, so I will. Our current moment may have given rise to a particularly public and zealous uncoupling of race and racism from the social world human beings have made. Even so, the current conservative to my thinking tendency among many liberals to divorce racial inequality from the political economic processes that generate them, what I call race reductionism, has had a long history. And this is the history Toward Freedom, my new book, explores. That said, I need to be clear that Toward Freedom is a left critique of post-war and post-Reagan neoliberal anti-racist discourse. And I'm going to repeat that. It is a left critique of post-war and post-Reagan neoliberal anti-racist discourse. The book sets out to draw attention to the consequences of liberals' long retreat from class-based understandings of inequality in favor of what I call race reductionist frameworks, defined, once again, as constructs that generally abstract racial disparities from the political and economic developments that engender these disparities. Though my scope spans from the New Deal through the election of President Trump, my analysis takes off from Senator Bernie Sanders' failed bid for the 2016 Democratic presidential nomination. The reason for this is that 2016 was a pivotal moment in American progressive as well as democratic politics. Why is that? Well, on the one hand, the fact that 43% of the 2016 Democratic electorate took to Sanders' calls for free higher education, national health care, regulation of Wall Street, and policies intended to encourage downward redistribution of wealth made clear that a quarter of a century of bipartisan conservative neoliberal policies, which have widened the divide between the rich and everyone else, had not eliminated the potential for a return to the kind of public good model of governance that both grew the American middle class and laid the foundation for the modern civil rights movement. That's on one hand. On the other hand, the fact that Hillary Clinton handily won the so-called black vote was cause for concern, given the damage inflicted disproportionately on African Americans by her husband's conservative neoliberal welfare, criminal justice, trade, and labor policies, along with his deregulation of the banking industry. And of course, the same, or at least much the same, could be said about Joe Biden and the black vote in 2020, even as Biden, to his credit, was a stronger candidate than Hillary Clinton and ran, I think, in a more openly progressive platform than Hillary Clinton. What was the most striking thing about Sanders' poor showing with black voters in both 2016 and 2020, however, was that liberals and many left identitarians often attacked Senator Sanders from the right via rhetorically left identical political or left identity politics construct. So I'll repeat that. So again, what was really striking is that liberals and many left identitarians often attacked Senator Sanders from the right via rhetorically left identity politics constructs. Specifically, Sanders' liberal critics generally cast his agenda as an anachronistic class politics that deflected attention from white racism and its consequences for blacks. Some of you may recall Hillary Clinton made this very case in 2016 using frameworks, interestingly enough, like systemic racism and implicit bias to deflect attention from the negative impact her husband's policies had on disproportionately black and brown people. Public intellectual Ta-Nehisi Coates' assessment of Sanders is of much more interest to us here this evening, however, since in many ways Toward Freedom could be read as the case against reparations. Though most of the subjects of this book are scholars, politicians, or political organizers, Coates appears throughout Toward Freedom largely because he has not only helped mainstream reparations, which had long been on the fringes, but he has done so via rhetorically militant, but in some ways politically conservative, if not reactionary, commitment to race as an ontological force. What I mean is that Coates insists that race, in contrast to all other ideologies with large cultural footprints, operates independently of political economy because it has, quote unquote, taken on a life of its own. Although I doubt neither Coates' sincerity nor his good intentions, I argue that his reparations project both proceeds from a basic mischaracterization of the inadequacies of American liberalism from the New Deal through the Obama presidency, and that his project is an unwitting call for continuing along much the same path that has ironically failed poor and working class blacks since the 1960s. Specifically, Coates had dismissed the utility for African Americans of class-based policies centered on downward redistribution of wealth, the kinds of policies, obviously that Senator Sanders had advocated, but so too had civil rights activists in the 1960s, which would have benefited blacks disproportionately, because Coates claimed that history shows that racism ensures that blacks would not benefit from such policies. According to Coates, the New Deal policies, such as discriminatory FHA mortgage policies and the Social Security Act exemptions for agricultural workers and domestic and personal servants, reveal the limitations of left universalism. Again, according to Coates, the war on poverty failed to redress inequalities, racial inequalities, because it failed to heed Daniel Patrick Moynihan's advice that, quote, Negro poverty was not white poverty. And again, according to Coates, Donald Trump's surprise presidential win over Hillary Clinton revealed the naivete of President Obama's post-racialism and was further proof of the inability of progressive economic policies, presuming Obama to have been an economic progressive, to trump, pun intended, a substantial number of whites' commitment to white skin privilege. There is no doubt that liberal public policy efforts have, as Coates has suggested, failed to fully redress the sources of racial disparities, even if anti-discrimination policies have, in fact, opened pathways for a stratum of black and brown people, myself among them. But from the post-war period forward, the problem with liberal social policy in this regard is actually that liberal intellectuals and policymakers tended toward race reductionism rather than class reductionism. This format obviously will not permit me to cover every element of the book, so I just want to cover a couple of matters, maybe a couple few, to draw attention to the issues that animate my analysis. I will do so by exploring the problems with Coates' assessment of New Deal universalism, as well as his mischaracterization of the war on poverty, both of which had become very popular, which is why it makes a lot of sense to cover this ground. From there, I will explore the broader conservative implications of his account. So I will hydrate and then move on. So let's talk about the unevenness of the New Deal welfare state. So for Coates, the racial limitations of universalism are made plain by New Deal and World War II era Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration redlining policies, as well as the Social Security Act's, which I'll refer to as the SSA from time to time, exemptions excluding domestic and agricultural workers from coverage. The realities, however, are more complicated than his narrative can accommodate. First, the exclusion of nearly all African Americans in the case of mortgage policy, or most blacks in the case of the SSA, from coverage under FHA-VA mortgage policy and the Social Security Act certainly reflected the racial sensibilities of many Americans of that era, which was a long time ago, and that's worth not losing sight of. However, these laws' parameters also revealed the centrality of economic exploitation to what we reflexively call racial bias. What I'm getting at is that if one considers that the FHA and Social Security Act were drafted with input from the real estate and agricultural industries, it is apparent that the exclusion of African Americans from federal mortgage policy and other such welfare programs disadvantaged most black workers with the aim of enriching business interests that had long exploited them. In fact, the majority of domestic and agricultural workers exempted from Social Security Act coverage, 74%, were white, until the law was revised in 1950 and 1954 anyway, and that's also worth considering. It's important to remember that the American Farm Bureau, the largest agricultural lobby of the day, had actually lobbied against extension of SSA coverage, not just to field hands, whatever their race, but also to farm-owning proprietors, because the AFB opposed the tax, and of course, plantation owners viewed the Social Security Act benefits as a threat to their managerial prerogatives. Likewise, discriminatory mortgage policies didn't just create racially tiered housing markets and predatory lending practices that left black homeowners vulnerable to unscrupulous contract sellers who sold blacks' homes at inflated prices and charged them exorbitant interest rates, though that was one issue. Racially tiered housing markets also created opportunities for real estate investors called blockbusters to exploit white homeowners. White homeowners obviously fared much better than blacks. There's no question about that. But and the obvious reason is they were able to buy mortgages on good terms that were subsidized by the federal government, and blacks weren't, at least not before 1968 generally. But the uncontested winners in this system weren't whites per se. The real uncontested winners in the system were real estate speculators. Second, it is true that blacks did not receive relief at rates equal to their needs, thanks to discrimination in the administration of relief programs, New Deal relief programs, if you've forgotten what I'm talking about. A fact historians and social scientists have written about for decades, which can also be said, I should add, of the Social Security Act exemptions and redlining. So I do want to repeat that while there's seems to be an assumption in many quarters that historians had long overlooked the limitations of the New Deal, the unevenness of its rewards, the reality is scholars have long discussed this. And in fact, as I've made a point of saying, I first learned about these very issues my first semester of college, way back in the fall of 1988, when I read Harvard Sitkoff's The New Deal for Blacks, which was 10 years old at that time. So it was published in 1978. And I also learned, I learned about the unevenness of New Deal relief programs then. And I would learn just a semester later in a course that I took also as an undergraduate in the late 80s, early 90s on race, on the U.S. welfare state in the post-war era, thanks to an article by Joe Quadagno. I'd also learned about other problems related to the Social Security Act and the like. So this is not, new. The slant is new, though, and this new slant is actually quite conservative. But anyway, I digress. So it's true that blacks did not receive relief equal to their needs, thanks to discrimination in the administration of relief. Still, it's also no less true that millions of African Americans benefited from New Deal direct relief and work relief programs, such as the FARA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration, the Public Works Administration, and the Works Progress Administration, while Black workers in industry and commerce shared the benefits of the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, which promoted unionization, and the Fair Labor Standards Act. It is also worth noting that Blacks ultimately showed their support for the New Deal with their votes, as African Americans would leave the so-called Party of Lincoln for the Party of Roosevelt in 1936, at least in national elections. Finally, when combined with the high rates of Black unemployment during the Depression decade, the New Deal's efforts to right a listing capitalist economy by extending legal protections to workers for the public good not only encouraged African Americans of this era to view race through the lens of economic exploitation, as they generally did, but the New Deal would also establish the legal framework and the institutional capacity for political mobilization that were at the heart of the modern civil rights movement. So I'm going to move on to the post-war era. In the post-war era, the right would turn in American politics. The assault on organized labor and, of course, the Cold War displaced discourse on race and inequality grounded in political economy in favor of frameworks centered on ethnic group culture and interpersonal relations. And while Ta-Nehisi Coates and a slew of activists and commentators on MSNBC and elsewhere have claimed that generations of liberals have tended to downplay race and racism's role in shaping outcomes, this is not really true of post-war liberalism. Through concepts like ethnic pluralism and culture poverty, in fact, liberal intellectuals in the post-war period stressed the sway of ethnic racial attitudes and culture rather than structural economic forces over group progress. Coates has celebrated Daniel Patrick Moynihan's, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan is the author of the so-called Moynihan Report. Coates has celebrated Daniel Patrick Moynihan's emphasis on the distinctiveness of Black poverty, which Moynihan traced to what we might think of today as structural racism and, of course, the culture of poverty. Specifically, Coates contends that the Johnson administration's failure to recognize the distinctiveness of Black poverty led to class rather than race-based. And I should say, Coates contends that the Johnson administration's failure to recognize the distinctiveness of Black poverty, again, according to Coates, led to class-based rather than race-based initiatives, which ensured the war on poverty's failure. While there is little doubt that the war on poverty failed to close the material divide between Blacks and whites, Coates' assessment of the war on poverty's deficiencies is inadequate. In fact, the war on poverty's failings were owed largely to liberal policymakers' decision to divorce or to separate Black poverty and unemployment from political economy. And in fact, the clearest rhetorical example of this is that policymakers by this period in the post-war era tended to discuss poverty and emphasize poverty a bit more than joblessness, right, or unemployment. Guided by the President's Council of Economic Advisors, President Johnson's war on poverty did, as Coates asserts, set out to lift all ships. But as is commonly misunderstood, the expression "a rising tide lifts all boats" was not a call for policies that centered on downward redistribution of wealth. In fact, the rising tide lifts all boats was the opposite. It called for treating growth by way of tax cuts intended to stimulate aggregate demand through trickle down, again, rather than the kind of redistributive measures that people like Bernie Sanders, or maybe more importantly, Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, and A. Philip Randolph had called for. Believing high rates of Black poverty to be exceptional, exceptions to the capitalist system of that era, the Johnson administration also identified anti-discrimination legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as programs intended to redress poor Black soft and hard skills deficits, such as Job Corps and Volunteers in Service of America, as crucial to closing the divide between African Americans and whites. The interesting thing about this, though, and I've kind of alluded to this already, contemporary left critics of the war on poverty, including contemporary black left critics, such as black socialists and labor leaders Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who I'm sure many of the viewers know were the actual organizers of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, argued that African Americans were losing ground vis-a-vis whites, not just because, or not even principally because of racism at that point, and at that point is the early 1960s, but thanks largely to the structural transformation of the U.S. economy from a manufacturing base to a white-collar, service, and high-tech base of employment. Since the early 1950s, the low-skilled unionized jobs that had been crucial to the expansion of the white middle class of Lower were actually being eliminated, first by automation, and then eventually deindustrialization. In his case for reparations, Coates contends that President Johnson identified redistributive programs to redress black poverty as key, while again, according to Coates, Randolph and Rustin demanded race-specific remedies. However, Coates actually mischaracterizes each stance. In other words, the white liberal president identified race-specific remedies as the tonic, while the black organizers of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom identified redistributive programs centered on public works and social investments as indispensable to any serious effort to close the gap, the economic gap, between blacks and whites. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin would make this plain, not just by way of the demands of the March on Washington, though that's certainly evidence of their sentiment, as were their statements at the rally. But just a couple of years after the March on Washington, they would make their sentiments plain through the Freedom Budget for All, which was a $100 billion program drafted by former CEA head Leon Kaiserling, which sought to close the racial wage and wealth gap, if you will, via guaranteed living wage employment for all able-bodied Americans. And this was, again, the brainchild of black leaders, civil rights leaders and labor leaders, and socialists, for what it's worth, Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, in concert with the former CEA head Leon Kaiserling. The bottom line is that the Johnson administration ultimately rejected redistributive programs precisely because it presumed, as Coates insists it should have, that Negro poverty was not white poverty. The war on poverty thus failed in large part because policymakers viewed racial disparities not through the lens of political economy or class, as one might think of it, but through the lens of ethnic pluralism, as many activists and today, along with Coates, insist we should. Ta-Nehisi Coates had cast the 2016 election of President Trump as evidence of the inexorable white prejudice that he believes dominates the infeasibility, or demonstrates the infeasibility of class-based politics, while making clear that reparations is the only conceivable fix for lingering racial disparities. While Coates acknowledges Hillary Clinton's deficiencies as a presidential candidate, or I should say he had acknowledged it, he, like the DNC a few years ago, and more recently, had attributed Trump's surprise win over Secretary Clinton, in part to a white working class that is so pathologically committed to white skin privilege that it voted against its own class interests. And in fact, this is a line that is still with us and had gained quite a bit of traction in early January as well. To be sure, Coates is clear that working class whites are not solely responsible for Trump's win in 2016. Nevertheless, the fact that Clinton lost to Trump in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Minnesota highlights for Coates and many other liberals and left identitarians the limitations of class-based appeals. Such claims, of course, not only look past the fact that many of the white voters Trump flipped in 2016 had voted for a black man in 2008 and possibly even 2012, but these claims also require that one project an economic progressivism onto the Obama presidency and even the Clintons that was just not there. It's probably worth noting that in 2020, Biden, who had pledged to support the PRO Act and had likewise publicly committed to a more progressive economic agenda than Secretary Clinton had, fared much better with union households than Hillary Clinton had. President Obama had won union households by 23%, I believe, in 2008 and 18% in 2012. Hillary Clinton, by contrast, won union households by just 8% in 2016, whereas President Biden won union households at a rate that was comparable to President Obama's 2012 victory, clocking in at about 16% margin of victory. Likewise, Coates could not explain how whites who are allegedly so racist that they supposedly voted against their own class interest, and this is a constant line at this point, but why they're so racist that they voted against their own class interest to obliterate the legacy of the nation's first black president, how you could possibly persuade such whites to embrace reparations, a welfare program from which they could never benefit. And I'll repeat that. Coates does not explain how or why whites who are allegedly so racist that they supposedly voted against their own class interest to obliterate the legacy of the nation's first black president could possibly be persuaded to embrace reparations, a welfare program in its best case scenario, from which whites could never hope to benefit. Coates does not have to explain this, of course, partly because reparations' appeal, at least as he casts it, is that it is at best a call for reforms, and at worst a call for modest reforms, and at worst a call for moralizing rather than a demand for substantive structural changes. There is, of course, no doubt, again, that post-war liberal orthodoxies failed to redress racial disparities. The culprit, however, is not the sway of metaphysical racism, as many suggest today, including Ta-Nehisi Coates, but rather the roots of contemporary disparities can be traced to far more comprehensible forces, such as the tensions within the New Deal between the regulatory and compensatory state models, which is something that Professor Moak, I know, has written about, and the related mid-century tensions between industrial and commercial Keynesianism, which, again, I know Professor Moak has written about, the contrasting influences of the New Deal and the Cold War and the parameters of liberal discourse about race and inequality, and neoliberalism's rise from the ashes of the Keynesian consensus. In other words, the failure of post-war and contemporary liberalism is not, as many activists today and some public intellectuals such as Ta-Nehisi Coates insist that liberals have long attempted to redress black poverty by reducing racism to class exploitation, resulting in universal policies that focus on economic sources of inequality as an alternative to addressing racism. The problem is that liberals have, one more time, divorced racial inequality from political economy. Informed by culturalist, racialist constructs like ethnic pluralism, culture of poverty, and underclass ideology, liberal policymakers have generally downplayed or even ignored the impact of issues such as deindustrialization, decline of the union movement, and the retreat of the public sector on African Americans. The consequences of this disposition were not so horrible in the 1960s, partly because the Keynesian consensus ensured a commitment to a public good-oriented approach to governance. But while the Keynesian consensus led liberals of the 1960s and 70s to pursue an anti-poverty agenda centered on the expansion of social services and even state-centered regulation of the employer-employee relations via affirmative action, the neoliberal consensus, under which, and I should say the conservative neoliberal consensus, ensured that centrist Democrats, such as President Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, would, following the lead of their Republican counterparts, pursue agendas that chipped away at the public good framework, that established the rights and protections that have benefited disproportionately Black, poor, and working class Americans at the very same time they either championed or personified diversity. In this context, Coates's insistence that so-called racial issues exist apart from economic issues is not a critique of post-war liberalism, but it is, at best, again, a call for continuing along the same path that has failed most Black Americans. To say that post-war and contemporary liberalism have not served most Black Americans well, though, is not to deny either the historic importance of or the current need for anti-discrimination policies. anti-discrimination legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I should say, such as the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 68, and policies like affirmative action have helped to improve the lives of Black Americans, my parents and myself among them, just as my Black grandparents benefited from the GI Bill, believe it or not, the education component, and New Deal programs. Nevertheless, these and other anti-discrimination policies have failed to eliminate disparities because earning power for all but the top wage earners has been on a 50-year decline, and that's the key point. According to sociologist Robert Manduca, median household income increased between 1968 and 2016, and I should say median Black household income. So again, according to sociologist Robert Manduca, median Black household income increased between 1968 and 2016 from the 25th percentile to the 35th percentile, while median white household income moved from the 54th percentile to the 57th percentile. But despite these relative gains that Blacks have made, with the aid of anti-discrimination policies, which I certainly understand myself to be a beneficiary of, the wage and wealth gap has barely budged since 1968 because automation, the slow death of the union movement, and public sector retrenchment have contributed to the decline in real household income for, according to Manduca, the bottom 80% of American workers. The good news, and this is important, is that the relative gains that Blacks have made over the past few decades have prevented the racial income gap from worsening. Had Blacks not made any relative progress over a period in which income gains have been confined to the top 10 to 20% of wage earners, the ratio of median Black to white household income would have fallen from 57% to 44% between 1968 and 2016. So that's positive. Of course, the bad news is that had overall wages remained constant, had we not been on a 50-year decline in real wages, the Black-white family income ratio would have actually risen from 57% to 70%. And this is why I insist that if we're serious about redressing racial disparities, we can't just focus on race-specific policies. We actually have to advance class-based policies. The call for universal programs such as Medicare for All, which I believe about 70% of Americans still profess to support, and redistributive class-based programs like the Fight for 15, which the majority of Americans also profess to support, a more robust public sector, a stronger union movement, tuition-free public higher education, etc., is neither a denial of the existence of racism, nor is it a call for eliminating anti-discrimination policies. But the point is that if we don't view racial disparities through the lens of American political economy, not just racism, we will fail to redress income inequality, and of course, we will fail to eliminate Black poverty. Instead, we may end up with prescriptions that merely rebrand as reparations or moral reckonings or whatever, already proven inadequate, means-tested or trickled-down policies, or worse yet, mere symbolic gestures. I said gestures, that was funny. Anyway, and of course, we've already seen this to date as many Democrats, informed by the realities of the political infeasibility of reparations, a cash transfer from which only from whites to Blacks, as it would be perceived, have scrambled to rebrand reparations, as reparations. So I should repeat, we've already seen efforts to date on the part of many Democrats to rebrand as reparations, means-tested and targeted programs, including subsidies for Black entrepreneurs intended to function kind of like President Nixon's appeal to Black capitalism a long time ago, as a kind of intra-racial trickle-down project, while corporations champion charity as reparations. This concern is, of course, at the heart of my critique of Coates. And while Coates is, again, unquestionably well-intentioned, his mischaracterization of the root causes of the failures of liberalism, and liberalism, though it's been better than conservatism for Black Americans, no question about that, liberalism has, of course, failed to fully redress the inequities that are before us. But his mischaracterization of the root causes of the failures of liberalism and the use of moralistic metaphors as an alternative to analysis creates space to sidestep solutions, actually. Consider the following passage from the case for reparations on the utility of H.R. 40, right, which has been breathed new life, or has new life breathed into it, I should say. So I'm going to read a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. Perhaps after a serious discussion and debate, the kind that H.R. 40 proposes, we may find that the country can never fully repay African Americans. But we stand to discover much about ourselves in such a discussion. Insinuating that the exercise alone has the potential to check racism's eternal sway, he continues, quote, the recovering alcoholic may well have to live with his illness the rest of his life, but at least he is not living a drunken lie, end quote. Coates ultimately goes on to say, what is needed, and here's another quote, what is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. What is needed is a healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. The moralistic pitch of the case for reparations, along with Coates's fuzziness on the difference between anything reasonably understood as reparations on the one hand and torts and charity on the other hand, led me to conclude the following, which first appeared in an article I published in March 2018 and is likewise in Chapter 4 of Toward Freedom. And this is a quote from me from March 2018. The quote is actually written in the summer of 2017, but published in March of 2018. Whereas President Obama's soaring post-racialism licensed the continuation of liberal indifference to the plight of economically marginal people via underclass metaphors, Coates's post-racial commitment to racial ontology signs off on white liberal hand-wringing and public displays of guilt as alternatives to practicable solutions to disparities. To be sure, this is not the formal intent, not Coates's formal intent, even if the words on the page imply that Coates might find a racial festivus to be an acceptable alternative to material compensation. But because reparations is a political dead end, Coates is offering white liberals and even a stratum of conservatives who are either self-consciously or reflexively committed to neoliberal orthodoxies absolution via public testimony to their privilege and their so-called racial sins. In keeping with that assessment I proffered in a public way anyway in March of 2018, conservative columnist David Brooks's transformation on reparations is a good example of the issue that I point to. Over the past couple of years, Brooks has moved from being a Coates fan who had dismissed reparations but appreciated Coates's explorations of Black rage to a self-identified supporter of reparations, at least as a brand. And it's that at least as a brand issue that's the star of the show. In his March 2019 New York Times op-ed piece, The Case for Reparations, David Brooks would declare the necessity of reparations to mend a racial divide, quote, a racial divide born out of the sin, end quote, of slavery, which not only inflicted injury upon the slaves, but Brooks goes on to say, slavery's corrupting influence over the whole society can still be felt today. While Brooks asserts the time for a racial reckoning and a payment of the collective debt, and he uses racial reckoning and collective debt, so those are quotes, is now. So one more time, while Brooks asserts the time for a, quote, racial reckoning and the payment of a, quote, collective debt is now, he rejects reparations in the form of direct cash payments, as do 70% of white Democrats generally, and does so by quoting the following passage from Coates, and Coates is the case for reparations. So here's the passage that from Coates that David Brooks quotes. And so we must imagine a new country, reparations by which I mean the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. What I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injustice, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. A year later, Brooks would describe his vision of reparations in a New York Times op-ed titled "How to Do Reparations Right," published in June of 2020, the summer of our Great Awakening. According to Brooks, reparations, he said, quote, would involve an official apology, which would be free, for centuries of slavery and discrimination and spending to reduce their effects. So one more time, the which would be free was me. Couldn't help myself, apologies. David Brooks said, and I quote, reparations would involve an official apology for centuries of slavery and discrimination and spending to reduce their effects. The practicable solutions Brooks advocates, and this is the key point, center on grants to community leaders, people who have, according to Brooks, the clearest window onto their community's needs. And while Brooks acknowledges this sounds a lot like the failed community action programs of the War on Poverty, Brooks says the difference is that community action programs failed because they funded disruptive agitators who stirred up conflict between local activists and local elected officials. Of course, community action programs ultimately failed because community action was doomed to fail. As I argue in Toward Freedom, the Johnson administration had little regard, and I've touched upon this already, for the disproportionate effects of deindustrialization and automation on Blacks and other low-skilled workers, leading the Johnson administration to pursue an anti-poverty agenda that sidestepped direct job creation in favor of anti-discrimination legislation, which was, as I've already indicated, very important and good, but also cultural tutelage for the so-called Black underclass, at least as we would call them years later, as well as tax cuts intended to stimulate economic growth, all of which, I should add, are proposals that Brooks has endorsed as well. The Sanders campaign helped, and I'm going to wrap up now, just so you know, the Sanders campaign helped to inspire, particularly among young people, an interest in the return to the public good model of governance that grew the American middle class of lore, but does not dominate today, and helped lay the foundation for the modern civil rights movement. Since the 2016 Democratic primaries, topics that had long been dismissed as pie in the sky, like living wage policies, true national health care like Medicare for all, a more robust union movement and expansion of the public sector have been part of the regular discourse. The brutal murders of disproportionately Black and brown men and women caught on video have likewise helped galvanize calls for criminal justice reform, which is good. There is a lot of potential for real and truly meaningful change in this moment. One potential impediment, though, could come in an ironic form. The decades-long insistence that we conceptualize racial issues as matters that are entirely distinct from class issues poses real challenges to redressing the problems that impact Blacks disproportionately. Simply put, if we view the problems of poverty, healthcare, and criminal justice through a lens that filters out the political economic underpinnings of these injustices, and these are in fact injustices in my view, informed by a language of moral reckoning, let's say, we may just end up achieving modest reforms, or worse yet, symbolic gestures, when what we really need is fundamental structural change. And I am done with, according to my phone, about 30 seconds to spare.
All right, thank you, Dr. Reed. Really appreciate that. We have several questions already, and I think maybe it makes sense to start with some of the more policy-specific ones that I think are in reference to your discussion of the New Deal policies. So one question comes from Aiden in the chat, and Aiden asks, what are your thoughts on a portion of the American Rescue Plan that is said to provide relief for Black farmers? And I think this is referring specifically to sort of a carve-out within the recently passed COVID relief plan that directs $5 billion specifically towards Black farmers. Is this an example of sort of a positive development that we should be lauding, or is it?
So I'm aware of the controversy, right? Because Lindsey Graham has made quite a bit of hay about this or over it. And, you know, precisely because of Lindsey Graham's response, I can't quite wrap my mind around why it would be necessary to target $5 billion of relief exclusively for Black farmers. And I'll tell you why. I mean, there's a facet of this that actually seems politically tone deaf to me, for what it's worth. And that's the key point, right? So let me just stress this. We live in a democracy. We live in a democracy that necessarily, particularly if you're invested in people who are on the margins, who obviously don't have money to contribute to politicians' coffers, and that's important. So what they have to offer is their votes, basically, right? And in that specific context, then in order for people at the bottom to get ahead, they have to ally with other people at the bottom. Failure to do that undercuts the ability to move forward. Rich people can cut checks. And I will say I have friends who worked in politics, and things that I knew in the abstract just from reading gained a new vibrancy when I would have conversations with my friends who worked in politics, which made clear the importance of coming to politicians with the promise of support for campaigns down the line, right? So in this particular context that I've just sketched out, which is something I think we all kind of know to varying degrees reflexively, I don't quite get it. There's another layer, though, that I don't quite get either, which is this. And again, this has to do with the political feasibility of it. Because from my vantage point, I'm sure these Black farmers are deserving. I have no problem with subsidizing agribusiness, and not just because I live in Illinois and I'm surrounded by cornfields. And if I spoke out against subsidies for agribusiness, I would probably have hell to pay. So that's not the only reason that I support or I'm fine with subsidies for agribusiness. But I have some difficulty imagining that this carve out or the problems that Black farmers face are exclusive to Black farmers. And the more politically astute approach would be to expand the net, even if it's not as morally satisfying for some. It would be to expand the net and not carve it out that way. And here's how I want to play with this. So bear with me as I make this up in real time. So many years ago, this would be in 2007. 2007, I listened to right-wing talk radio. It's not because I'm a conservative, because far from it. I like to consider myself a spy. And so I listened to Rush Limbaugh, at first unintentionally, but I decided that there was some intellectual value to understanding how this right-wing populist, as people would call him, connected with his audience. And one thing that I was struck by in 2007, this is around the time of the mortgage crisis, right, the beginnings of it, was the fact that before I had ever heard of Michelle Bachmann, Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck had already attributed the economic crisis that was before us, owed to the housing bubble having burst, to, as Rush Limbaugh et al. Would have put it, the minorities and the welfare that the Bush administration, interestingly enough, within this paradigm, had doled out to profligate minorities. Now, this is an old playbook, right? It's quite an old playbook that's existed for longer than anyone could have imagined affirmative action, I suspect. But so it's been around for a while. Shortly thereafter, I heard, shortly after hearing Rush Limbaugh make the case that profligate minorities were to blame for the total collapse of the U.S. economy, minorities who were living beyond their means, buying houses they couldn't afford. Shortly after I heard this is the recurring theme from right-wing talk radio, and then eventually Michelle Bachmann, Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton insisted that the problem with the housing crisis was that Black homeowners were devastated by it. And I thought in real time, as one who listened, who paid attention to what the other side was saying, that even as Blacks were clearly overrepresented among people who had been devastated by, what would this be? The unethical practices in the housing industry, right? Aided by the deregulation of the banking industry that Bill Clinton signed into law back in 1999, even as Blacks were overrepresented among the victims of the subprime mortgage crisis. They were not the exclusive victims of the subprime mortgage crisis. However, the right wing certainly insisted that Black folk were the exclusive victims. It didn't make sense in that context for progressives to say that Black people were the exclusive victims of something that they weren't actually the exclusive victims of, because it makes it harder to build the coalition. A, because it's not true, right? I mean, that's the first issue, right, if that matters. But B, thinking politically, that approach makes it much more difficult to build the base for support from the bottom up for the kind of egalitarian remedies in the case of the subprime mortgage crisis, or I would likewise suggest in the case of the American Rescue Plan, the carve out for Black farmers. It makes it more difficult to maintain, to build support for these kinds of policies that African Americans might benefit from disproportionately, but not exclusively. And I want to stress this, that in most cases, certainly most cases that I can think of, the issues that impact Blacks, generally speaking, that we tend to think of as racial issues, certainly impact African Americans disproportionately. But I can't think of too many, I actually can't think of any at this moment, but I'm not operating on a lot of sleep, that impact Blacks exclusively, right? And that's one of the things that inform my analysis in general. And if that's the case, and it's certainly the case with the subprime mortgage crisis, it's certainly the case with police murders, it's certainly the case with the inmate population, it's the case with poverty and unemployment too, and a host of other issues, then why not make the more politically astute case in a democracy that could build support for achieving victory, right? I want a real victory. I don't care about moral victories. And in fact, I would submit that many of us who are progressive are so committed to achieving the moral high ground that too often we fail to realize that we've successfully achieved the moral high ground in a valley surrounded by our enemies. And that just makes you the highest target on a level plane.
Thank you. This next question kind of ties in and builds off of that previous question, and it comes from Jen in the chat, who really appreciated your exposition of why class-based economic policies will also serve as a project of reducing racial disparity. Her question is another policy-specific one, which is how would student debt forgiveness and reinvesting in public universities work into this?
Well, I think the two people who have the hot mic teach at public universities. So I believe that I have a bias of sorts, which I'm happy to throw out there. But so reinvestment in public higher ed, I think is important. I think the most important reason that it makes sense to invest in public higher ed comes down to the most important reasons, come down to a couple of things. And one is the one facet of Jen's question, which has to do with reducing student debt. Obviously, student debt is a great impediment, and I would say it hobbles many college graduates and people with professional degrees and other kinds of graduate degrees, preventing them from really achieving kind of stability in the post-industrial age that young people who were often enough high school graduates could achieve by their early 20s, right? And I will share an anecdote with you as part of this. So most of my friends, a large percentage of my friends from college had student loan debt deep into their 40s. A decent percentage of them had difficulty, were not able to buy homes. And these would include white people because of the student loan debt that they had. And then, of course, if they lived in major metropolitan areas, like, I don't know, San Francisco, Boston, DC, New York, who the hell can afford to buy real estate who isn't wealthy already in those communities, right? And if you're, a full-throated capitalist like someone like Elizabeth Warren, one of the problems then, and they couldn't buy these homes in part because of the student loan debt and, of course, the comparatively depressed wages. If you're a full-throated capitalist like someone like Elizabeth Warren, then one problem that student loan debt poses is to capitalist growth, right? I mean, workers don't have money to spend on stuff, right? Now, I'm not a full-throated capitalist, but I wanted to throw the full-throated capitalist that bone. Another reason, though, that I think it's important to reinvest in public higher ed is, as I point to in Toward Freedom, there was a time in far-off exotic, what's it called, America, where public higher education was free, tuition free, and if not tuition free, really cheap. So as I tell my students regularly, since I'm in Illinois, I use Illinois universities as points of reference, that when my parents and Hillary Clinton and George Bush, Al Gore, and President Trump, I think, were all in college, and they're all boomers, of course. Tuition at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, which I call Chambana, but tuition at University of Illinois Chambana was in 1968 about $170 for the entire year. I think when all was said and done, if you roll in room and board, it was twice that. but $170, if you were to adjust for inflation, I think is probably somewhere between $1,200 and $1,400 today. We used to do public higher education cheap and or free in America. And we don't have to even turn to countries like Denmark, for example, which comes up for blueprints, right? Taxpayers used to fund public higher ed. And public higher ed then was a social service of sorts, right? It was a public good. It's actually the way to put it, rather than, and so we paid for it as taxpayers, rather than a service that users pay for with tuition. Why is it important? So that might sound like a lot of wind up. So here's my pitch. I think one reason beyond the full-throated capitalist reason to support a return to taxpayer-funded tuition-free public higher education, we can see in January 6, 2021. And frankly, I'm kind of surprised that there's been not a lot of attention devoted to the important role that encouraging students in America to do what students in America had done after World War II, let's say, and through much of the Cold War, to major in subjects like, I don't know, history or political science or sociology, anthropology, English or philosophy, the liberal arts. But the liberal arts that encourage you to actually think about democracy and the human world that we all occupy. Colleges can do this. And the failure of colleges, the tendency to treat colleges as white-collar vocational tech training actually results in a population that is credentialed, but knows very little actually about the history of this nation or its even recent politics, right? And the things that politicians used to do. And so, again, there was a lot of wind up, but my pitch is that, my short pitch, if there's such a thing, is that funding public higher education isn't just a public good to help people get jobs. It can function as a public good to shore up a democracy that's in real jeopardy, right? So those are the reasons that I would point to. I don't know if I answered all of Jen's question, but.
No, I think you did. And full disclosure, Jen is also a professor at a public university. So I think we're preaching to the choir there for sure. So the next question I have is kind of about a tactical or how we should think about things standpoint. And this is coming from Samantha in the chat. And she says, so when we look at issues, should we look at them from a more holistic point of view rather than from a strict racial lens due to the limitations of looking at just race?
The short answer is yes. We should look at them from a more holistic vantage point. But I think to make this a more interesting answer, I think it can be easy to appreciate the value of looking at racial inequality through a more holistic vantage point if one has sat through, experienced, suffered through, whatever verb you want to use, anti-racism training. And if you've sat through, experienced, or suffered through anti-racism training, one thing that one of your takeaways from this is certainly one of the takeaways for me, anyway, from sitting through anti-racism training, is that as many times as facilitators and people who write on anti-racism, I won't name names, draw on constructs like structural racism to explain racial inequality. In reality, the cases that they make are not actually, the fixes that they identify, I should say, are not actually structural. The fixes that they propose are quite modest reforms in the grand scheme of things. And specifically, and I know Professor Moak has written about this himself, so I would value your input on this too, even though I'm the guest. Specifically, what we get in terms of the fixes, just to make sure that to bring the rubber to the road. And the basic point that I'm making is, instead of proposing fixes that are structural, the anti-racist training, which has a narrow racialist lens, proposes individualist fixes for what I do think are in fact societal problems. At least the disparities are evidence of societal problems, right, or structural problems, come in the form of treating racial inequality as the consequence of bad actors. If you take, and so what you get from anti-racism training often enough is that one fixes racism, which they describe as structural racism, but it's not really structural, by either replacing bad actors with good actors, firing the bad actors, racists, and replacing them with good actors, or retraining the bad actors to be good actors, right? And those are your two fixes. Now, that doesn't address whether or not there are enough decent paying jobs to go around for people who either don't have a lot of formal education or have bachelor degrees or even advanced degrees, right? And I think that's kind of the appeal of it. But to broaden the scope even further, the history of, and I would say fairly recent history from my vantage point, the last 50 or so years of liberal reform policies have actually oscillated between two different frameworks that identify bad actors as the source of inequalities. And they've oscillated between two different bad actors, because the only lens, or the predominant lens, that liberal policymakers have gravitated toward is race. And what are those two categories of bad actors? They're white racists in one column, right? And I hope that we can all agree that racists would be bad actors. But in the other column, the bad actors that we get from frameworks that sidestep political economic understandings of inequality are the poor Black and brown people themselves. And the consequences for identifying poor Black and brown people as the bad actors, we lived through by way of the war on crime and the war on drugs, right? And if we're interested in, let's say, redressing the disparities in the criminal justice system, then this framework that identifies bad actors, white racists, or the Black underclass, as it would have been called in the 80s and 90s and maybe early 2000s, as the root causes of disparities, not only don't provide fixes. In the good moment, the fixes are anti-racist policies, which have some benefits, just inadequate benefits. But in the bad moment, the fixes are building more jails, more prisons, and lengthening the sentencing, right? And even expanding on capital punishment. So the failure to have a political economic framework, right, or a more holistic framework, maybe, which is a better way to put it, that seeks to make sense of racial inequalities, not just by way of the racialist frame, which actually centers simply on bad actors, often enough at the expense of structural, impediments and sources of inequality. That sets us up for not just inadequate policies in the better moment, but actually really quite draconian, anti-democratic policies in the more conservative moments, like the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. I blathered a bit. I'm sorry about that one.
No, I think that makes a tremendous sense. And I think I will just pop in here and say that I have seen this in some of my own work. And one of the things that immediately comes to mind, and I was just looking at some of the responses to the turn away from, or the desire to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. And what more recent proposals have been is, rather than sending kids to jail, which is obviously a horrible thing and we should support not sending kids to jail. The solution has been, one, we need to sort of train teachers in sort of how to deal with sort of conflict in class. But the other thing is that schools have increasingly turned to things like aggression replacement journaling or positive behavioral intervention for students, which I think you correctly announced or correctly identify the problem, which we've the individual. Meanwhile, occurring in a context where schools have just been slashed, class sizes have been increased, counseling and nursing services have been slashed as well, and the jobs and economic conditions of the children's parents themselves have been completely deteriorated, but the focus is only on the individual change. So to me, that makes, your answer made a tremendous amount of sense, but there are several more questions in the chat, and I do want to get a little bit more specific of reparations. Why are reparations not part of this holistic approach to address both race and class? So why should we not consider this part as an effective response to the challenges of this moment?
Okay. So, if I heard the question, because you're breaking up just a touch, why are reparations not a part of this holistic approach, right?
Yeah, that's cool.
I would say this: what does reparations mean? And that's something that I've touched upon in my lengthy talk. Reparations means a lot of things to a lot of different people, right? And so my first response is just that. We know, for example, that what is not likely to happen, and I'll not hem and haw. We know what's not likely to happen is cash transfers, right? I mean, it's not likely that the 40-something million Black Americans or Blacks in the United States, because the 42 million Blacks in the United States aren't even necessarily Black Americans. We know that the federal government is not going to cut us individually checks for $800,000 to $900,000 each, right? Now, if it would, I will confess, then I could maybe think about retiring one day. And as a public sector employee, I wonder if that will ever be an option for me. So, I guess I would take the money, but then that gets me to another issue, which is how long would I have to spend it if it were to happen? And there's no path forward politically for that one. But if that were to happen, how long would I have to spend it before a more competent version of President Trump made his way into the White House and his minions burst down on my door and took my money, right? And that is a kind of flippant way to get at the political infeasibility from another vantage point. For most of Black American history, even for Black Americans, reparations has been a marginal issue, right? Reparations as such. It's been around for a while. And if you ask me, one of the great tragedies of American history is that the freedmen, the former slaves, were owed reparations. They were denied reparations. And reparations, there was actually a path forward, to provide reparations for the freedmen because radical Republicans had advocated seizing the property of individuals who committed high treason against the United States of America. Obviously, secession was in violation of the U.S. Constitution, in defense of the undemocratic institution of slavery, and in redistributing those plantations or those properties to former slaves. And to be perfectly honest, not only do I think that's just, and certainly former slaves made the case for it, many of them, as a form of back payment for wages that they were denied under slavery, but I think the American South and American history writ large would have been better off had we taken that path forward, not just for reasons related to the racial wealth gap, but I think that actually gets complicated because there's been a lot of history a lot of events have unfolded between 1865 and 2021. But also because the most conservative, the most reactionary, anti-democratic elements in the South, the plantation aristocracy, would have been marginalized, right, politically and economically, had that happened. It didn't happen, though. But had that happened, yeah. But unfortunately, that did not happen. there has been a lot of history that has taken place since then. And to be perfectly honest, I think not only because reparations is politically infeasible, like anything reasonably understood as reparations is not going to happen. Instead, what we're getting is rebranding. But the rebranded versions of reparations, and this is the point that I'm making, precisely because reparations, in the true sense of the word, isn't going to happen, are actually just calls for more of the same. What's really discouraging about the reparations discourse, and I'm one who is quite clear that anti-racist, what people would call anti-racist policies, what I'm going to call anti-discrimination policies, remain necessary. Of course, for some people, anti-discrimination policies constitute reparations. I think that's a creative definition of the word reparations. But precisely because reparations is this now catch-all, wed to the morality of it at the expense of victory, right? And real tangible victories. Then what we get is this rebranding again of policies that are in fact inadequate as essentially alternatives to pursuing the policies that would in fact benefit blacks disproportionately, right? So we've heard politicians say that at this point, and proceeding, I think, from a gross mischaracterization, as I've alluded to the problems of post-war liberalism, that we've done class, and that hasn't served black people well. So now we need to do race, and we need to do race first. Well, the reality is we actually didn't do class. And most of the people who are suggesting that we do need to do class, and I'm certainly one of them, insist that doing class does not mean that we eliminate anti-racist or anti-discrimination policies. To the contrary, there are people who are racist. I've known many, and I haven't enjoyed the company of any of them. And some of those people have positions of power that do, in fact, impact people's lives adversely. So we need anti-discrimination policies. I wouldn't call anti-discrimination policies, reparations, though many are. But we also need class-based policies. I want to stress this, though, that many of the so-called reparations policies proceed from the view, and I think this is quite a reactionary and dangerous view. And so reactionary, I mean really conservative and counterproductive view, proceed from the vantage point, from the assumption that all Black Americans share a common interest, right? And so when you proceed from that vantage point, what you get, as we are already seeing, is an insistence, let's say, that if we grow the ranks of Black entrepreneurs, and this constitutes reparations for some, if we grow the ranks of Black small business people, or for that matter, grow the ranks of Black CEOs and COOs, Black executives and managers, or even professors, then what will happen in the grand scheme of things, because representation matters, because all Black people share the same interests, that the benefits that are directly paid to Blacks at the top, right, these individuals that I've laid out, will necessarily trickle down to Blacks in the middle and the bottom. And I think one of the great things about 2016, let's say, and the last few years that have followed, is that we've gotten a clear sense that trickle down, I wouldn't say it's run its course, but we've gotten a clear sense that Americans on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat alike, are not happy with trickle down and how it's worked out for them. I mean, that's especially true in transparent and unambiguous ways with Democrats. It's kind of true with many Republicans as well, even if they express it differently. Trickle down hasn't worked. And yet now we have people advocating trickle down under the banner of reparations as something that will work for Black people. And it will work for Black people because of presumption of a shared common interest, a presumption. So that's one element of the reactionary assumptions that drive reparations. And another related one is, I think everybody should be wary of the idea that the sins and suffering of one's great fill-in-the-blank great grandparents are the sins and suffering of people today, right? And that kind of framework actually is the framework that is a close cousin, if not an identical framework that contributes to things like racial profiling and many of the problems in the carceral state, right? That I've known my fair share of racists over the last few decades. And one of the things that I've heard from racists on the regular back in the day and to this day is that if blacks didn't commit all those crimes, they wouldn't be racially profiled. Well, it's not true that blacks committed all of those crimes. They're overrepresented, but they're overrepresented among perpetrators of violent crimes and property theft because those crimes correlate with poverty more than race, right? So you have that, and African Americans are overrepresented among the impoverished. But so they're not committing all of those crimes. But the B point is that those racists take the disproportionality, right, as evidence of totality, and they deny individual black people the opportunity to be sized up as individual black people, right? I mean, it's the clear justification for profiling and other forms of racial discrimination that black people, myself among them, have been the victims of, is a framework that you actually see, albeit with a positive spin, embedded in the reparations framework, in the current reparations framework. And the last point that I'll make on this point, on this topic, is that the current reparations framework, or the dominant reparations framework, and I think this is just kind of the nature of the beast, reduces the inequalities that are before us to racism and its legacy without really addressing the mechanisms that inform the disparities, right? And one of the points that I made is that, let's say, the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 68 have actually had some important impact on improving the lives of Black Americans. The impact that those anti-racist policies, we're going to call them, I think of them as anti-discrimination policies because that's what they really are. The impact that those anti-discrimination policies have had on Black people has been pretty significant. My parents were in the first wave of Black Americans to benefit directly from these kinds of civil rights policies. Both with respect to their employment prospects, and they became homeowners at a very early age. I'm a downstream beneficiary by way of the trickle down from my parents, and of course, the continued utility of such pieces of legislation, right? The problem with those particular policies, though, is even as they've mitigated, racial inequality, they haven't been able to eliminate it because the sources of what we think of as racial inequality aren't really reducible to racism. And that's kind of the problem with reparations, too. Because as I mentioned previously, we have been on in this country a 50-year downward slide with respect to wages and actually wealth, for what it's worth, for the bottom 80 or 90% of American workers. Had the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 68 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 been passed in the 1940s, we probably wouldn't have the disparities that we have today, actually. And what reparations looks past is that the economic game has changed, right? I mean, how do you, and this gets me again back to my quip where I started, and then I'm going to shut up. But it gets me back to the quip where I started with how long would I have to spend the $900,000 check before a more competent reactionary is the euphemism I'm going to go with, populist makes his or her way into that White House and stirs the resentment and directs it that's already there, right? And a lot of the resentment toward various peoples. Some of it's deserved, right? I mean, we should all be resentful toward the rich people who have billions of dollars, I would say, while the rest of us struggle to make ends meet. That person, that hypothetical scenario, I would not have that money for any length of time, right? The reason I made that quip is because the reparations narrative looks past the fact that that the white middle class isn't really growing. And in fact, the white middle class is on a decline. If the white middle class is on a decline, then how do you make a case to Black Americans who never fully benefited from the rewards of the New Deal welfare state, who didn't fully benefit from the rewards of post-war liberalism? How do you say to these broke white people, yeah, you're privileged, so you should cough up some portion of your check and give it, let's say, to someone like me, who, is a tenured professor, who's reasonably well compensated, and, I'm not an essential worker. So I've been working at home for a year, right, with virtually no risk of picking up COVID-19. How do I say to a white working class person or middle class person who's recently unemployed or whatever, you're the privileged one and I'm not, so give me some reparations, right? I mean, you have to really think about the political feasibility of this, as well as the actual context that we're operating in, and they're two sides of the same coin. Sorry.
No, I think that is a very helpful articulation and answer to that question. I'm not sure we have time for it, but there are so many great questions in the chat that I might just throw out three that I think are kind of related, and you may see them as related or not, but I think they are all kind of touching on the same thing. Two are more historical, one is looking a bit more recently. So the first of these related questions is, how did the racial democratic or identitarian framing destroy or overtake the social democratic tendency in Black politics? The second is, do you believe that the tendency for left identitarians or liberals to adapt race reductionism is a reaction to the reality of political powerlessness with regards to changing post-World War II material conditions? And the third is sort of asking us what we do with this analysis in the current moment, which is, how do we responsibly oppose race reductionist education amidst conservative attempts to overhaul any topics of racism from school curriculums? And this person gives the example of Governor DeSantis, most recently speaking out against critical race theory.
Okay, so the last question was, how do we responsibly oppose race reductionist frameworks in a context in which the right is challenging, when the right is challenging teaching race in any form?
Yeah, I think, or even maybe even the existence of racism as a reality.
Okay. Okay, so I just want to write this down so I don't forget it. All right, cool. I think I have it down. So I'm going to go with the last question first, and we'll see if we have time for the others. So and I'm gonna trip the light anecdotal for a second. I think that it's important, obviously, to teach race and inequality, not just at the university level where I do it, but in high school, right? And one of the things that I hated about my years in public high school a long, long time ago, but it seems that things hadn't changed much, at least until pretty recently, is the kind of whitewashing and sanitizing of American history. And since I'm an academics kid who was tasked with reading Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States when I was in the 8th or 9th grade, I went into high school with a pretty cynical understanding of history. So while I'm one who, and I'll add one other layer, one of the things I've always liked about my job at Illinois State University is that we have this great history education program, which means we train a lot of high school history teachers. And I've had the opportunity to teach a lot of really great, dedicated high school history teachers who actually do indeed infuse racial inequality and gender inequality, et cetera, into their classroom curriculum to the best of their abilities. Now, that's my setup. Here's my anecdote. So while I think it's really important to teach race and inequality and the like, in this moment, in the moment in which I was a kid and all points in between, I think the race reductionist framework is counterproductive, actually. And it does the devil's work insofar as it actually helps to court right-wing opposition. It's going to be there, right? But it paints a big old target on your face for no intellectually defensible reason. And here's my anecdote for you. A long, long time ago, when I was in my 20s, the one year in my 20s that I wasn't in school, I lived in New Orleans, and it was a great time. But in New Orleans in that time period, David Duke had run for governor and U.S. senator just a couple years before I moved to New Orleans. And there was a controversy over a monument to the Battle of Liberty Place. And the monument to the Battle of Liberty Place was a monument to white supremacists in a city that was probably back then about 70% black. And it appeared at the foot of a major tourist site. So it was kind of, I would say, embarrassing, but that was the least problematic problem on a long list of problems. It was also bad history, right? And when there was a push to remove this monument, David Duke and his supporters beeline to the monument in defense of it. And they said something, I was 22 at the time, they said something that has stuck with me ever since, which is this. And keep in mind, this monument was bad history, right? It was to the brave white men who fought to overthrow the corrupt black Reconstruction government in Louisiana, in New Orleans at that time. What David Duke and his minions said about the monument was that the blacks have their history, and this is our white history. Now, the reason that stuck with me, and it jumped out at me at 22, and I was on my way to a doctoral program in history that fall, for what it's worth, is that, well, I mean, it's a wrong-headed way to look at history, right? There's not a the blacks history, nor is there a the whites history. And it highlighted the problem with the kind of multiculturalist approach to history, which we often see in high schools. And in my day, we saw it from a kind of right-wing perspective that was a little more like what David Duke had in mind, an effort to sanitize American history so that American history would be spun at the high school level as a vehicle for spinning affirmative narratives. Truth be damned, right? What mattered was an affirmative narrative was the conclusion. I think that a lot of the kind of multiculturalist frameworks that have come to dominate what people who are progressive today, many people who are progressive, understand to be a better approach to history, suffer from the very same problem, right? I mean, what their end game is not to make sense of the events that happened on the ground, right? Which is what professional historians do, and hypothetically, that's what happens in college level history courses. But instead, the end game is to spin self-affirming narratives. And they seek to counter the ridiculously, pat and inadequate narratives that sanitized American history with equally pat reductionist narratives from the other side. You replace the teaching of great white men with no detail and no complexity with the teaching of great black and brown people, whatever their sex, or great women, whatever their race, likewise with no complexity or detail. And that is an anti-intellectual project. And I think we see a lot of that jumping off. And of course, it's not as if, the right is ready for us, right? And I'll just say this. I've taught a lot of conservative students over the years. I wouldn't say that they all loved me, but a lot of them walked away with a certain degree of respect for me, I would say. Again, not all of them. Ultimately, because they listened to Rush Limbaugh, and Rush Limbaugh told them before they entered college, and their cousins and uncles and aunts told them and parents told them before they entered college to be wary of these liberal professors who were going to indoctrinate them and teach them that white people are evil and the minorities, and particularly white men, and the minorities, of course, are great. And what those conservative students who respected me, at least, irrespective of whether or not they liked me, I didn't necessarily change their worldviews, is that I presented a picture of complexity for them. And that is not something they were ready for. The right is ready for stripped down narratives that seek to counter, those horrible narratives that I grew up with in high school with the black, brown woman equivalent, right? They're ready. They've been ready for that. And it behooves us, those of us who understand ourselves to be progressive anyway, to just, dig in and embrace complexity, right? Otherwise, we're giving them a freebie.
Thank you. And thank you for your generosity with your time. I know we really appreciate it. We've gone slightly over, but I would thank all those in the chat for their great questions. I'm sorry we were not able to get to all of them. I know we could have a even longer useful discussion, but I do encourage those of you who, if you've not done it already, if you're interested in hearing more of Dr. Reed's argument, his book, Towards Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism, does cover a lot of these themes in the class, and I think you would all enjoy it. So with that, I also thank you to Dr. Reed, and thank you to all the people that attended online.
Thank you. Yeah, and the questions were fantastic. I'm sorry that I couldn't get to all of them. But I was so inspired by the ones that I got that I couldn't shut up. So apologies.